In a small village between two golden hills lived a girl named Elara. She didn't want a normal life. She didn't want to be a farmer or a weaver. She wanted to be a legend. She wanted to be the best potter in the world. In her mind, she saw a jar so beautiful, so thin and so perfect that even the king would bow to it. But there was a problem. Elara was a dreamer who was very afraid of making a mistake. Every morning, Elara sat at her desk. She had lots of paper and many pencils. She drew circles. She drew the curves of a jar. She read about soil and how heat changes clay. She knew everything about pottery from books. Her neighbors saw her working hard at her desk. They thought she would become a master. But if they went into her workshop, they would see something strange. Her pottery wheel was covered in dust. Her clay was hard and dry like stone. In 3 years, Elara had made nothing. She was waiting for the perfect moment, the perfect mood, and the perfect plan. She told herself she was being careful, but the truth was, she was stuck. One afternoon, Elara looked at her drawings and felt very sad. She was no closer to her dream than 3 years ago. She decided to go to the great city to meet Master Ares, an old potter famous across the land. When she arrived, she smelled wet earth and wood smoke. Spinning wheels made a humming sound like a heartbeat. Master Ares sat on a low stool, his hands covered in mud, smiling at his students. Elara walked up to him. Her voice was shaky. She showed him her beautiful drawings. "Master," she said, "I have studied for years. I know the theory of the wheel and the secret of the kiln. I want to make the perfect jar, but I am stuck. I am afraid that if I start, I will fail. How do I begin? How do I make my first jar a masterpiece?" Master Ares looked at her drawings and then into her eyes. He did not praise her art. He stood up and wiped his hands on his apron. He looked at his 20 students. He decided to do an experiment that would change Elara's life forever. He split the room into 2 groups. Elara sat in the middle to watch. "Listen," Master Ares said to the first group on the left. "You are the quality group. For the next 30 days, your only job is to make 1 single jar, but it must be perfect. If there is 1 tiny scratch, or if the shape is a little uneven, you fail. Take your time, plan carefully, work slowly." The quality group looked nervous. They whispered and measured their clay with rulers. Then, Master Ares turned to the second group on the right. "You are the quantity group. I don't care if your jars are beautiful. I don't care if they are crooked or ugly. Your grade is based only on weight. If you make 50 kilograms of pots by the end of the month, you pass. If you make less, you fail. Now begin." Elara watched both groups. The quality group sat in silence. They spent the first 5 days just looking at the clay. They were afraid to touch it. When they finally did, they moved slowly with tiny, shaky movements. Every time they made a small mistake, they stopped and cried out in frustration. They spent hours trying to fix 1 tiny bump. On the other side of the room, the quantity group was full of energy. They laughed and shouted. Because they didn't care about being perfect, they threw the clay onto the wheels with force. "Look at this one," a boy shouted, holding up a jar that looked like a squashed hat. "It's ugly, but it weighs 2 kilos. He threw it onto the done pile and quickly grabbed more clay. They made mistakes all the time, but they also learned. They learned how much water made the clay smooth and how much pressure made the walls fall down. While the quality group was still thinking, the quantity group was doing. Elara watched them and felt a small spark in her heart. She realized that she had been living like the quality group her whole life, sitting in silence, afraid to get her hands dirty. As the month went on, the workshop became more intense. Elara stayed every day to watch. The difference between the two groups was like night and day. The quality group was suffering. Because they could only make one perfect jar, they were terrified of every move. Their hands shook so much that they made even more mistakes. One man spent 3 days trying to make the base of his jar perfectly flat. He was so worried that he pressed too hard and cracked the whole thing. He had to start over, crying in frustration. They were not becoming better potters. They were becoming more stressed. They thought too much about every finger movement, and their work looked stiff and lifeless. On the other side, the quantity group was having fun. They were like children playing in the mud. Since they only cared about the weight of the clay, they didn't stop to worry. If a jar fell over, they just laughed, rolled up the clay, and started a new one. They made 10, 20, or 30 jars a day. But then, something magical began to happen. By the second week, the quantity group's hands started to move on their own. Because they had felt the clay fall apart 100 times, they knew exactly how to hold it. Because they had seen 100 jars wobble, their muscles knew how to make them straight. They weren't reading about balance in a book. Their bodies were learning through doing. Their ugly jars started to look a little better. Then a little better. Then they started to look actually good. By the final week, a strange silence fell over the workshop. Master Eris called for the final judging. The quality group went first. They carried their single jars like they were made of glass. Most jars were okay, but they looked cold and boring. Some were not even finished because the students had been too afraid to fire them in the kiln. They had spent so much time dreaming of perfection that they forgot how to actually create. Then came the quantity group. They brought boxes and boxes of pottery. They had huge piles of failures that they put on the scales to reach their 50-kilogram goal. But tucked inside those piles were a few jars that took Elara's breath away. These jars were thin. They were strong. They had beautiful flowing lines that looked like they had grown from the earth itself. They were, in every way, perfect. The group that was told, "Don't worry about being good," had ended up being the best. Master Eris turned to Elara. "Do you see now?" he asked softly. The quality group spent the month talking about what perfection looks like, but the quantity group spent the month building it. You cannot think your way to mastery. You must work your way there. Elara looked at her clean, soft hands. She looked at her dry workshop back home. She realized that her fear of being bad was the only thing stopping her from being great. She had been waiting for the mountain to move, but she hadn't even picked up a single small stone. "I have wasted 3 years," Elara whispered. "No," Master Eris replied. "You have spent 3 years learning what doesn't work. Today is the day you start learning what does." Elara didn't say another word. She didn't go back to her desk to draw a new plan. She didn't look for a better book. She walked over to a bucket of wet, gray mud. She pushed her hands deep into the cold clay. It felt messy. It felt heavy. It felt imperfect. She sat at a dusty wheel and pushed the pedal. The wheel began to spin. Her first jar was a disaster. It looked like a melted candle. It was lumpy and crooked. But for the first time in her life, Elara didn't feel sad. She felt alive. She rolled up the clay, threw it back down, and started again. 1 year later, the village had a festival. Elara stood behind a table filled with the most beautiful pottery anyone had ever seen. People traveled from far away just to touch her work. "How do you do it?" a young boy asked, looking at a jar that seemed to glow in the sunlight. "How do you make them so perfect?" Elara smiled and pointed to a large bin behind her table. It was filled with thousands of broken pieces, cracked handles, and lumpy bases. "The secret isn't in the jar you see on the table," Elara said. "The secret is in the 5,000 jars I broke to get here. I stopped trying to be a master, and I started being a student of my own mistakes. Don't fear the mess. The mess is where the magic grows." Elara was no longer a dreamer who did nothing. She was a creator who did everything, one small, messy piece at a time. And in the end, she didn't just make the perfect jar, she made a perfect life.